today. That for the both Prince Edward County Field Naturalists and the Quinte Field Naturalists, because both of those organizations are so appreciative of the work that Quinte Conservation does and the great work that Ontario Nature does advocating for our natural areas, as we all know how important that is. So we're really pleased about tonight's speakers. I think it'll be very exciting. Before we get started, I do just want to recognize that I myself am here as a settler on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people. And I always like to quote Robin Wall Kimmerer because she's one of my favorite authors. And I was trying to think, what really talks about the importance of nature, and that in the Indigenous worldviews, quite often they consider all parts of nature as persons, as real as we are, which they are, obviously. And that's something that we seem to have lost. And that's what this quote is about. Robin Wall Kimmerer was saying that the animacy of the world is something we already know, but the language of animacy is teetering on extinction, not just for Native peoples, but for everyone. Our toddlers speak of plants and animals as if they were people, extending to themselves an intention and compassion until we teach them not to. We quickly retrain them and make them forget. When we tell them that the tree is not a who, but an it, we make that maple an object. We put a barrier between us, absolving ourselves of moral responsibility and opening the door to exploitation. And I think that, like, to me, I just really spoke to me, and I really so much appreciate the work that these two organizations do to continue the personhood of our natural areas, the forests, the trees, all the living beings that the web of life depends on. And now we're going to have Robin Riley come, and he's going to introduce our amazing speakers. Oh, how do I get in?
Good evening, everyone. I had the pleasure of speaking to some of you 2 weeks ago, but why I'm here tonight is because Don Wilford, who is the really the energy behind this whole speaker series, is ill tonight and couldn't speak, and so somebody had to stand in for him. And this is the last of them. Don, basically just wanted to recognize the good work that these organizations were doing and sort of added this one on to the normal agenda of this speaker series as a kind of extra bonus. And I just want to also just recognize what an effort Don had, put in to have this series going once a month and all through, since October or so. I guess they've been a great series and a great thing to come, to this church, to this group, to give us all a sense of what the Green Party is about and where it's going, but also just more broadly to bring in a variety of environmental perspectives and make us, think about the future. Fortunately, I do know the two people who are speaking tonight. I particularly know Corina. She and I worked in Ontario Parks for a number of years and agreed on all sorts of things and locked horns on all sorts of things. But she's wonderful. I consider her a friend as well as a work colleague. Yeah, she was the biologist for Ontario Parks and in this Eastern Ontario area. And of course, when I was at Sandbanks, that's where we interacted a lot. But Corina is now working for Ontario Nature, and I think she can probably speak to what her current role is. But that's her life's work, regardless of which hat she's wearing. And Tim, I know a little bit. Tim and I, again, interacted a little bit in my role in the parks, but also in our property, we were planting a zillion different kinds of trees and stuff. And something I spoke about when I last spoke was about things like chestnuts and issues and challenges of forest succession. And Tim was just telling me how his particular interest as a forester is on sort of forest history, and we got off just a few minutes ago on that tangent of what the forest has been and where the forest is going, and that, and I think he brings some of that perspective. He works for Quinte Conservation as their forester, and of course his role is to try and maintain, but also nurture and perhaps even expand the variety of forests that grow in our Quinte region, and so he will speak about that. I think, Tim, you're speaking first. Is that correct? Okay. So without further ado, I welcome the two speakers.
No, that's Corina's. That's the very end. Yeah, that was easy. Holy. Small crowd, I know, but there you go. You just click at the very top. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Okay. So where do we start? I work, obviously, I guess I work for Quinte Conservation. Our office, Quinte is actually an amalgamation of 3 conservation authorities. And that happened in the 1990s, more or less. So Quinte, as you can see on that Google Earth image on the very left, that giant gray spot is Toronto and or the GTA. And obviously, maybe we're not that far away. We're about, 2 hours from downtown Toronto. So when you look at things from that perspective, when I look at things from that perspective, we are very, very, very lucky in this area to have a conservation authority, or that idea, that premise that still survives to today. But also to have captured captured the biodiversity that was not represented, I guess, in one way, not represented in the park system. Can I flip slides, please? Thank you. So, sure. I guess maybe I'm just a little, can I turn this one on? The feedback. Hi, here we go. That's much easier. If that's all right. Is that all right? Can everyone hear me if I come over here? It's a little less crowded and no, no one cares. Okay. Okay. So too loud. I'm not used to microphones, to be honest. I usually just shout. That said, if you can't hear me, just wave. So going back to, again, the 1940s, right? Going back to the 1940s, I guess I'm not in the picture. Is that you folks? Yeah, okay. I apologize. IT is not my thing. So, okay, so going back to the 1940s, the province, interestingly, copied what was happening in the States, in the Ohio Valley, in the Tennessee Valley. Probably some people have heard of the Valley authorities. And what they were copying at the time was the premise that we had degraded our landscape, that we had cut too many trees and drained too many wetlands, and certainly, modified the earth in our favor. And we had an extensive amount of erosion happening. and an extensive amount of unproductive farms as well. Unproductive being not meeting the modern standard of agriculture, even at that time in the 1940s. Okay, so they invented or copied really the idea of a conservation authority from the States. In doing so, the province subsidized 36 conservation authorities across the province to purchase property, outright purchase property. We did not target the productive, scientifically interesting sites like Ontario Parks did. We collectively targeted poor agricultural lands. Okay, so that's really important context to what I'm talking about here. But as you can see, this is a headline from Conservation Ontario. Collectively, conservation authorities are the second largest private land owner in Ontario. So that's a lot of property when you really stand back and think about it. Could you flip one more slide, please? So in our neighborhood, and I think you can see Picton's down here in the bottom, of course, because we're based on river drainage. Is that better if I hold it closer? Okay. We are based on river drainage, our watershed, again, because of the problems of the time, right? The erosion, the lack of forest cover, the flash flooding, conservation authorities were based on watershed basins or yeah, watersheds anyway. The Americans like to call them drainage basins, but the idea being that we go almost to Bancroft or Lamab, close anyway. The eastern extent is over towards Charlotte Lake and the Napanee and Salmon rivers, the Moira River being on the west side, I guess, and then all of Prince Edward County. So as you notice on that map, and you probably can't see very well, the orange blobs are our property holdings. Yeah, so most of our property holding is actually in the north part of the watershed. Part of that was on purpose, being that when you slow the water down, the snow melt, particularly with forest and wetlands, it reduces flooding downstream, right? So at the very bottom of the river, Moira River, is the city of Belleville. And at the very bottom of the town of Napanee, or sorry, of the Napanee River system, is the town of Napanee. So that was considered really important. If you're going to go buy property, buy it in the headwaters so that you can slow these floodwaters down and the erosion, like the soil, right? Yeah, mostly degraded agricultural lands, very thin soils, very wet soils, and unproductive, bald granite often. In the very north and east corners, you can see two fairly large blocks. The one block was owned by the Rathbun Logging Company. And if you've never heard of those, look them up because it's a really interesting history. Had a sawmill complex in Deserano and thoroughly, and I mean that, cut every stick of wood they could. I mean that, off that property block. So again, our office ended up with it in the 1940s. So since then, there's been a lot of slow but sure growth of the forest. Why conservation areas? It's the most fundamental that everyone seems to know about conservation authorities. And they were developed mostly in the 70s and 80s, again, with provincial funds. And the idea at the time was outdoor recreation would encourage the conservation ethic. So way back then, imagine that even my childhood, there was no phones. There was nothing digital to play with. So go outside, kids, play in nature. Hey, we've got trails, we've got access to swimming holes, whatever, and learn about nature when you're a kid because you'll appreciate it when you're an adult, right? That was the premise. Please, thank you. So fast forward to today. So we've got all this property sitting all over the place. Conservation areas, everybody knows about conservation areas, but what about all the rest of the property? So I'm not your classical forester. I think that's probably the fundamental truth. I always preferred planting them or letting them grow rather than cutting them down. Now that said, that doesn't mean I'm not a forester. It just means I'm not the industrial foresters. So all across the whole planet, right? We all, every single one of us, sit on a wooden chair and stand on a wooden floor. That wood came from a forest, guys, right? We didn't just snap our fingers. It didn't appear. So we have to manage, if we're going to produce wood, if we're going to use wood, which we do, obviously, we have to manage our forests. And how do you manage a forest? Well, really, you end up managing people. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. The forest, of course, can grow on its own. FSC is one of a few different certification bodies, but anyone here that's ever got a bank envelope, if you flip it over, you'll see this FSC stamp on it. If you go to your large wood retailer, like whatever, stores, you'll see a stamp like this posted on the 2x4s that you buy. I'm sure you've seen that logo. And what it is, it's a not-for-profit, non-governmental certification body. And it's global, literally. So it covers everything from, rainforest in Africa, some of the palm oil plantations, et cetera, in Indonesia, some of the plantation wood that comes out of Chile, et cetera. Some of Europe, Eastern Europe. Canada has the most forest certified of any country across the whole world. So we're really good at managing forests, and with it, managing people. So FSC certification, to achieve that was quite a lot of effort for our office, but it was deemed as integral to assist with modernizing our own forest management. And again, in this context, a forest is a property holding, not necessarily a big block of timber up north or what have you. But the certification still allows us to have some public vetting of our goals and aspirations for our forest. But it also recognizes First Nations that were here before us. It recognizes worker rights, so people that actually harvest on the properties. Also recognizes community engagement. There's a set of principles. So anyone that's interested in that stuff, I'll leave you to look it up, FSC. Essentially, many of these large corporations that you see here are supporting purchase of wood or wood products by only purchasing FSC certified. So that's a really good thing in the long run. I mean, somebody has to stand up and say, hey, this is really important stuff, right? And you and I consumers, we all sort of blindly purchase, if you will. Hopefully, you're now looking for an FSC sticker. But the idea is there. And you can see all the major companies, Microsoft, Google, McDonald's, Walmart, right? Next slide, please. So I just wanted to say that through the certification, our certification holder, certificate holder, is actually the formerly known as Eastern Ontario Model Forest, now Ontario Woodlot Association. So if no one here has heard of the Ontario Woodlot Association, I would strongly recommend that you look them up online again. There's a very thick manual of how we manage our forests, our property holdings, and all of us collectively, I think on the next slide, or it doesn't matter. Next slide, please. There are several of us across the province that are in that pool. It's called the Community Forest Group. Not all conservation authorities are certified, and not all county forests are certified either, but several local examples include ourselves and the Northumberland County Forest, for example, and other conservation authorities in the area, in Eastern Ontario. So what do we do again with all this property? Well, we had a whole lot of thought happening in the background because this is a lot of property, and we were told by the province to produce this anyway, but thankfully we had already, by going through the certification, already come up with the premise of what to do where to sharpen our focus. Revenue is a big deal. Most people don't realize that conservation authorities, our primary operating revenues come from your municipal tax base. So it's essentially a per house tax. It's around $8 on average across the province. As you can imagine, we have a lot less houses here than we do in the GTA. Huh? So even though across the province we're expected to do the same things, essentially, it becomes very restrictive at times here in this area. So in order to assist with revenue, essentially to pay for staff, right? We have this huge asset, and it's an asset that's not producing any income or very little. We needed to sharpen our pencil, and we looked at things. We're continuing to expand our hunting leases. So we lease our property for hunting. That's an important driver for us. It does pay our property tax. By the way, we pay property tax as a conservation authority, as odd as that is, across the province. Paid parking. If you've been to any of our larger conservation areas, we have a paid parking pass gates system now. Part of sharpening our pencil was to focus where our forest harvest happens. And last but not least, and gets the most question, is the carbon offset program. Slide, please. So again, unfortunately, that's kind of too far away, but what we've done is essentially map the 7 largest conservation areas that will be receiving, with paid parking, we have a revenue source. We'll be spending that money back into our conservation areas, improving signage, trails, etc. We also identified our educational properties. So these will be the ones that receive, I'm going to call it guided tours by school groups, but also things like educational signage for the public. Nowadays, the snap your phone on the QR code, etc. Thank you. We're left with all these other properties, which we call conservation reserves. Okay, so they essentially sit there and grow naturally. And a lot of people don't ever see them, don't bother to go there or what have you, but they do sit there quietly, which is nice. Could I have one more? Thank you. And then last but not least, maybe, is commercial forests. So we do harvest about 4,000 out of our 30,000 acres has been designated for commercial harvest. That said, out of that 4,000, we only harvest about 400 acres a year. So more or less over 10 years. Okay, next slide, please. What we're harvesting, and here's the harvest schedule on the right, what we're harvesting is actually plantation, primarily plantation. So these were old fields that the province, again, heavily subsidized, planting trees in rows to subsidize, well, they subsidize it, sorry, but to stabilize the soil, slow down snow melts, right? So we do periodically go into these plantations, we thin them very lightly, we never take more than 1/3 at a time. And you can see even in this photo that the hardwood forest, the natural forest, does come in underneath. As you crack the egg, you make an omelet in a plantation. But now we have so again, 4,000 acres, that's plantation. What do we do with the rest of it? We're not making any money, which is fine in principle until you go to pay the property tax. And anyone here that's ever been around any natural resource use, you have to sustain you have to produce an income from your asset in order to pay your property tax and or produce a revenue, right? Or you're bankrupt as a natural resource business. It's just the way it is. So we approached, or I shouldn't say we approached, the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, Ontario Woodlot Association was approached by a company in the United States called A New Climate, and they developed a partnership about 5 years ago, and they ran with it. Can I get the next slide, please? And in the States, they've had carbon offset markets for about 20 years now. The most stable, probably heard in the news a bit about a minor player, but the most stable one anyway is the American Carbon Registry. It's based in California. Regardless, our parent group, the Ontario Woodlot Association, developed this partnership with A New Canada. It used to be called Blue Source. And we, being Quinte Conservation, saw the opportunity to receive revenue without increasing harvest. And that's essentially what a carbon offset is. We could harvest this much wood, but we actually cut way down here. And so the differential there is an offset. Does that make sense? So that that picture, there are 200 permanent sample plots established across our property, one of which is in Macaulay Mountain, and you'll notice little tree paint numbers. Anyway, regardless. Why forests? Why is that a commodity? What, right? Well, it's a commodity driven, like I mentioned, wood. So we have a really long scientific history of measurement in forests. So we know where we are in the globe, how much rain we get, how long our growing season is, how much the wood should grow, and therefore how much carbon it should absorb. The idea with the permanent sample plots is that you can actually go back again and field measure and verify your computer model, verify your mathematics, right? And I already mentioned that. So you can go one more. We're the first in Canada, Quinte Conservation, to go through the American Carbon Registry. That said, there are other carbon registries. British Columbia has its very own. Regardless, I don't want to bore you to death with all that detail, but the idea is there. It monetizes, carbon offsetting monetizes ecological goods and services. Finally, as a forester, I can let my forest grow, not cut it down at all, and receive an income, which pays for not only me, but staff or infrastructure to protect our forests, new fences, surveys, stones to stop garbage dumping. I mean, filling in trails, like you name it, right? Our conservation areas, as already mentioned. Next slide. Thank you. And this is my segue. So for me, it was fundamentally important that we cooperate with other groups in Southern Ontario, including Ontario Nature, and they brought forward the idea of a pilot project under this 30 by 30 target. And I was happy to say, sure, absolutely, use us as a pilot. And so at that note, I'll flip it over, but I think I have one more slide. Oh, yes, my very last that you already saw. So there you go. You have to think globally, but conserve locally, right? Anyway, thank you. Okay.
Hello? No. Okay, I look at the back table. If I speak up, that's okay. Yeah, good. Okay, great. Well, I'll let Lenny get my slides loaded, but thank you, Tim. That was a nice intro. Well, no, we're doing this together. Tim wasn't introducing our work. We work together. I'll introduce myself while we get sorted here. So my name's Corina Brdar, and as Robin said, I did work for Ontario Parks for most of my career as an ecologist. And then recently I joined Ontario Nature to continue doing, to have the opportunity really to do advocacy work for nature. So my role is I'm the conservation policy and planning manager there, and I lead a lot of our advocacy work. My main work is actually I was just telling Tim, in Northern Ontario with FSC certified forests, trying to find more protected areas in them and to push the government to protect land in Crown managed forests. But we also do work in Southern Ontario, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, so that's my last one. That's my last one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I will say, the work I'm about to describe, I didn't lead it. It was my colleagues, Jenna, Sarah, and Kelsey, who couldn't come. I live nearby. I live, where do well, I just said to someone tonight, I live near Albury, and not everyone knows where that is. So it's north of Ameliasburg and east of Carrying Place. So I'm here in the county, but my work is for Ontario Nature, which is provincial. And so that's why I work on projects across the province. Okay, good. Yeah. So Tim alluded quickly to this 30 by 30 target. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what that even is and what that means. And for those of you who are members of Quinte Field Naturalists, I did mention this a bit, but this will not be a repeat. Only one slide is the same. And then I'm going to tell you about what we did with Quinte Conservation and why it matters and why it's exciting and cool and why people should feel happy about it. Okay, so next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, so I think most people here know who Ontario Nature is. Certainly the members of Prince Edward County Field Naturalists know, and Quinte Field Naturalists. We are a conservation nonprofit organization. We've been around almost 100 years. We used to be known as Federation of Ontario Naturalists, for those of you who are familiar with that. So we're an umbrella organization with member groups like our two local naturalist groups, and we have also individual members, and we do a range of work. My team does the advocacy, as I mentioned, but we also do education and outreach, and we do our own forms of scientific monitoring. We're doing the Breeding Bird Atlas right now, which is such a cool project, and we just published reptile and amphibian atlas, which is free online, or you can get your hardcover copy if you ordered it. It's coming soon, which is cool. But we also have this beautiful magazine. I love like a real magazine. It's online, but I brought copies of back issues of our magazine. They're in the center table, so please take them. If you don't already have them, they're really well done. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. They're great magazines. Yeah, so that's us, just as an overview for people who didn't already know. Next slide, please. So, okay, you all know who this is. Who heard of COP15 in Montreal a year and a half ago? Oh, good. Yeah, okay, of course you guys heard about it, right? So that was also known as the Nature COP, and COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And it's the countries that signed on to the Global Convention on Biodiversity. That's what that was. And so it was a meeting where over 180 countries got together and decided these are the things we're going to do to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And they set out a series of 23 targets, and they all agreed and signed on, this is what we're going to do. And there's some about sustainable resource use, like forestry and agriculture. And there's a target that gets a lot of attention that's called 30 by 30, which means conserving 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. And like, that's a massive goal. And we're nowhere close. No country is close. So Ontario Nature is a big proponent of this goal. When I spoke to Quinte Field Naturalists, I mentioned that E.O. Wilson, who I think most people here would know, very famous naturalist who died fairly recently. He's a scientist, and he said we need to conserve at least 50% of the planet, really, so that we don't have catastrophic loss of biodiversity. So 30% is a good start. So next slide. So this 30 by 30 target, some more specifics about it are that it has to recognize Indigenous rights and the lands, the 30%, it has to lead to good biodiversity outcomes. That's what we want. Next slide, please. So right now, only 13% of Canada is protected, and we're right around 11% of Ontario, which isn't great. In 2020, there were targets that had been set in Tokyo 10 years earlier, and at that time, the target was 17% by 2020. So we're not meeting our targets yet. And for context, Ontario I didn't write down the whole numbers, but 1% of Ontario is 1 million hectares. So to bump this number up, that's whatever, 20 million more hectares that have to be either newly protected, or we have to look around and see what out there on the landscape is actually already protecting nature, and we just haven't counted it yet. And that's what our work with Quinte Conservation was. So next slide. So yeah, what does count? When I first learned of this concept, I was working on Ontario Parks, so it was very obvious, well, okay, provincial parks, national parks, those are protected areas. That's what you think of. And then Tim already mentioned conservation areas. If anyone spent any time in them, you know, like Massasauga Point or, you know, Beaver Meadow, all these beautiful places, those, I think to most people jump to mind, oh, these are protected areas. And like for me, I first grew up in Southern Ontario. Conservation Authority lands were the very first natural areas I ever spent time in. And I think a lot of people in Southern Ontario have close connections to them. But as it stands, they actually haven't been counted in, there's like a big database of what counts towards 30 by 30. Conservation Area Authority lands have not all been counted yet. And I'll get into the reasons why in a moment without going into too much detail. So thank you. So outside of provincial parks and national parks, other areas that have counted are some conservation authority lands have been counted because they've been looked at and checked and seen, yeah, you meet all the criteria to count. And then land trusts. Land trusts are a great example of lands that are managed and protected in such a way that they should count towards a 30 by 30. And then other lands that we've been looking at with partner municipalities is some municipally owned lands. So it doesn't really apply in our area. There's not a lot of progressive local land management on the municipalities part per se. And I hope if someone from the municipality is here, I'm sorry if that is a mischaracterization. But there are some municipalities in Southern Ontario who are quite progressive that we've worked really closely with. And actually the City of London was one of the first municipalities who was able to show that the lands that they manage as, say, environmentally sensitive areas have enough rigor and strict rules around them that they actually meet the bar to count towards this 30 by 30 that's meant to conserve biodiversity for the long term. So what is our role in this? Well, we've been working with both levels of government, well, all three really. It's a federal target, so they're very interested in making sure the target gets met. The province has a role as kind of the they have a lot of say over the rules on land management in Ontario, and then the municipalities, of course. And we've been working with other partners to go through all the different criteria they would need to meet to count towards 30 by 30. That's what we do. And so we've done a lot of this work, and so far the numbers up there, almost 23,000 hectares we've helped add to what counts in Ontario. And that is like not even a percent of a percent, a 0.1 of a percent, because I just told you 1 million hectares is 1%, but every little bit counts. And especially in Southern Ontario, where there's so few formally protected areas and where all of our biodiversity is and where all the people are, these little pockets of intact nature really matter. When we look somewhere like Northern Ontario, a small area is less meaningfully ecologically, so it might not count. But around here, those areas are so much more important. And so it's really important that they count. Next slide. So what we do when we work with different land managers is we have the expertise and experience looking at the way the land is managed to help them figure out, does it count or not? And I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. And then because we've been doing this for a few years, we share information with groups and examples to see, like examples of best practices for policies. Like if we look at their lands and they don't quite meet the bar, well, okay, here's what you could do to improve the management so that it could count. And then one of the big things we do can help with is press releases. And I think that's how Tim and I got invited here today. I think Dawn saw something in the newspaper. Yeah. And that was a press release we worked on together to get the good news out, which is good. Like, you do this work, you want to celebrate, especially right now for conservation authorities. It's really important to celebrate the good work that they do because of the threats that they face. Next slide. So I'll just spend 1 second on this really. When we approach a land manager, they approach us and they say, we want to count towards 30 by 30. We have conversations with them. We talk about the lands they own. We make sure everyone who's a decision maker on that land consents to it going into this global database. Well, it's a national database that feeds into a global one. And then we do the work to say, yes, you meet the criteria, you don't. And then we submit that information to the gatekeepers of who keeps track of what counts to 30 by 30. And in Ontario, that is the province actually decides what can go in. So our pilot with Eastern Ontario Model, Eastern Ontario Model Forest, now Ontario Woodlot Association, we were hoping, well, actually, Environment Canada, who's the lead because it is a federal target, they've been looking across Canada and trying to look at classes of land to boost this numbers towards 30 by 30. And they're like, well, what about community forests that are FSC certified? Is there some way that they can count towards 30 by 30? And for us, because we've been doing this work, we said, yeah, we can help look at that. And so we reached out, and Quinte Conservation was willing to go through this process with us. For us as a conservation-based organization, we want to make sure this isn't just a numbers bean counting game. Like 30 by 30, yeah. If it's meaningful, if we really can protect 30% of lands and waters, that's great. But if we're just like looking around, trying to make things count, I call it looking for loose change in the couch to reach 30 by 30. We're not into that as an organization. We want to make sure that we keep a high bar. These are the things that we're saying are contributing to biodiversity conservation. And if we can't reach that by looking at what already exists, then Canada and Ontario need to do more work to actually protect more land. So Tim already gave the background about Quinte Conservation and their collective forest management. So I won't go into that because he knows it better than I do. Next slide. So Tim already showed a map of their watershed and the lands that counted. And you can see them here in red. So we did, by looking across the lands that Quinte Conservation manages, both as conservation authority, like conservation areas, the ones that you know, but also these other lands he talked about where there's active forest management that is FSC certified, and there's parcels within that don't actually get harvested. Those count as protected areas because, well, the next slide explains why, actually, I think. Yeah, okay, so this is kind of the meat of what counts towards 30 by 30 and why Quinte's lands counted. So there's actually 7 criteria a chunk of land needs to meet before it can count. And so I was just speaking to Richard before we started, and some of you probably own some very nice parcels of land. I know Robin does. And it's not any nice piece of land that can count. There's actually pretty strict criteria that need to be met. These criteria are based on international standards, and then Canada adapted them to be appropriate to our landscape. And so we look at lands like Quinte Conservation Authority's lands and figure out, do they meet all the criteria? So I'll just go through them super quick. And if people are actually curious about the details of this, I can tell you more later, but it's like super technical policy stuff. But the first thing is it has to have well-defined boundaries. People need to know where it is. And we need to be able to find on a map, number one, because it goes on a big map later. So we need to be able to find on a map. That's easy. But the big one is the land manager and the people in charge of the land need to be able to control what happens on the land. And so provincial parks, that's easy. There's an act in place. The park has wardens. The park has a superintendent. They decide what happens on the land. In other areas, it's a little more work to figure that out. And they need to be able to control activities so that the activities that harm biodiversity don't happen. So that's a big criterion right there. Land trusts can do that because it's private land, and if people are trespassing, there's means to stop them from doing that. But with Quinte Conservation's lands in particular, because they have that FSC certification, and Tim talked a bit about how rigorous the FSC certification is, that was kind of another layer of protective mechanisms on the land. And I will say Ontario Nature is also a member of FSC. We're a very active member. FSC is the only forest certification program that environmental nonprofit organizations recognize. So when I started this job, I was telling my partner about it. And so he was at No Frills buying toilet paper. I'm like, get the FSC certified one. And he came home and he's like, look, I got the one with the label. I'm like, no, that's the wrong certification. That's the one that's not as good. So please do keep an eye out for it. We really do promote it as the most sustainable. It's not perfect, but it's better than no certification. So the other things that mattered for Quinte Conservation Authority's lands is they're protected for the long term, and it's somewhat difficult for the way it's being managed and the protections on it to be reversed. Really, anything can be reversed. A provincial park could be deregulated, but you kind of weigh the risks. And then we look at, what is the land managed for, and those kinds of things. And then what's the state of the biodiversity in the land? Because you could have a piece of land that's quote unquote protected, but it could just be kind of not in great shape, not have good biodiversity for what you expect in that area. So really that shouldn't count towards 30 by 30. Next slide. So as I said, the reason we, Ontario Nature, is interested in this work is we're not doing it just because we want to help reach some number to check some box. We're really interested in the conversations that take place with land managers about what is it that you're doing on your land that? Be protecting biodiversity? Like what policies do you have in place? What things are you doing that maybe we could share with other land managers? And for some land managers that we talk to where they don't quite meet the bar, we talk about, well, what improvements could you make so that you could actually count towards 30 by 30? And that's where we get involved. So that's why it was so nice that Quinte Conservation worked with us to act as an example for other similar land managers that are part of that collective of forest managers that Tim mentioned. Next slide, I think. Yeah, okay. So I'll just mention quickly. So we are also working with municipalities. Some municipalities have actually taken a pledge to meet 30 by 30 within the area that they're responsible on their own. Montreal was the first city to do that. And we're working with the city of Sudbury, is also working on doing that right now. Sudbury is actually a very huge municipal area, and there's been a ton of restoration work since we got rid of the super stacks, and it does not look like a moonscape at all anymore right now. There's a really active environmental core of people there, both within working for the municipality and with volunteer groups like yourselves. So the more municipalities we get on board, the better. For us right now, we're a bit dismayed to see what's happening with provincial regulations for nature in the province, as I imagine the people in this room are too. And so we've decided, okay, that's fine. That's what the province is doing. Let's talk to municipalities then. Where they have control, how can we boost them up? How can we support them? What can they do despite what's happening with some of the provincial laws right now? Yeah, next slide. So that's it. That's like a really fast overview of what 30 by 30 is and why it matters and what counts. It is actually pretty technical policy work. So I didn't want to go over too much, but I just want to give you a little taste of it. And I guess the one thing I do want to make clear that neither Tim nor I addressed is these lands that were in the newspaper, this however many thousand hectares it was, that is recognized now and is in this national and global database, this isn't a new type of protection, but it's a new recognition. And that in itself is really good, because by recognizing these things as being important for nature, it makes it harder to undo that protection. So that's why we're really happy that we were able to work with you. So thank you, Tim and Quinte Conservation, and thank you to inviting us here to talk about this today.
So if you have a question, so that the people on Zoom and it's recorded, if you want to come up, line up behind this mic, we'll take questions into the mic and then they'll need a mic.
So I have a question. So as I understand carbon offsets, as I understand carbon offsets is the idea that I want to have some industrial use, let's say, that's going to put a certain amount of carbon into the atmosphere, and I need to find someone who's doing something that would technically absorb that same amount of oxygen of carbon, so that it's neutral at the end of the day. So are you can you envision a time when someone might come to the Conservation Authority and say, we have some money here. Would you guys like to buy some land somewhere that you would turn into a conservation reserve so that I can do my industrial thing, and that you would then take that money and go shopping for some real estate? Is that a possible future?
Very possible. Now, just to back up, there are two major carbon markets in North America. There's the regulatory market and the voluntary market. We are in the voluntary market, which essentially means that those large global corporations that I mentioned are voluntarily purchasing our carbon for green publicity. That said, the regulatory market is slowly but surely being developed in Canada and other parts of the world. And so to answer your question, if funding was available to purchase more property, yes, we would definitely purchase property. I highly doubt that we in Southern Ontario will ever see the funds available to purchase enough property to truly offset an industrial application, like a steel mill or some factory therein. And that was part of the reason why we pursued the voluntary, the voluntary market. When you get into the regulatory market, globally, it has been trialed and dissolved in a few places, and really has been less stable, let's say, than the voluntary market. But in theory, absolutely, if there was the right property circumstance, yes, we could theoretically use our revenue, go purchase property and increase the amount of protected area. Absolutely.
My name is Rick Jones. I have a couple of questions, actually. One is a pretty simple one. I just not sure you can answer either one of you, but I've noticed in the last probably 10 years, our reforesting, when they do clear cutting of the land, when they replant the trees, they used to plant them 8 to 10 feet apart, kind of spaced out, so when the trees grew, they could grow to a significant size. What's been happening, what I've seen in the last 4 or 5 spots that I've been in that have been reforested, that the trees are like 3 and 4, 5 feet apart. Like they're just planting all the trees, but they're not actually managing the way they plant them. They're just planting all the trees, right? And so I just wondered who oversees what happens when they reforest after they clear cut like that? Obviously nobody, but I just wonder who's supposed to be overseeing that.
So in Southern Ontario,
Up and around Denby area, mostly
Denby.
Bancroft across, so not so
Okay.
much over Bancroft area as much as it is further east.
Yeah,
but,
fair
you know,
enough.
all through those areas.
yeah, so long story short, I would say it's the forestry industry. And they likely wouldn't clear cut very often in Southern Ontario, but instead what they're doing is thinning the existing forest so that you have a seed source. But in the case of white pine, which is probably what your vision is, you would do a fairly heavy removal, so like a 40% removal, and then you would underplant with red oak, for example,
Yeah.
or
Well,
so
what they seem to be
that's
planting
my
mostly
guess,
is
but
spruce or,
Okay.
yeah, mostly spruce. But,
I'd have to see it to answer your question like
yeah.
in context, but
Well, they're just cutting areas, maybe, you know, I call it small, like 20 or 30 or 40
Sure.
acres of,
Yeah.
you know, just clear cutting it right out and then replanting these pockets, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure that they're not
Yeah,
private
no,
either.
well, it'll
It
be one of
looks
those
like
things
it's
that I
all
will have
in
a look
crown
at
land
sometime
that
just
had
to
forestry
see.
rights too, but based on, well, I'm there hunting, so obviously I'd be trespassing if I was on private land. So,
Mhm,
you know, I'm pretty sure it's all crown land that they've been doing this recently.
mhm.
And I didn't notice it ever until, like I say, the last little while. It just seems like they're just planting the trees instead of actually managing how they
Mm.
do it, right? And I was just curious as to who's supposed to be making sure they're not just doing that, right?
Yeah,
So,
no, it's a valid point.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not a forester like Tim, so I could, but I am, because I am working in the Crown Forest. So that forest management unit is also FSC certified. And so any Crown Forest management, it gets audited by the province. And I don't know if they check the tree planting, but I know the FSC auditor would. So they would go in and look at, okay, here's you've cut here, here's your what's the word? Not restoration, but regeneration. And so they actually would check that. And so it might be something about the forestry science or the economics where they've decided that it makes more sense to plant them close together. A lot of tree planting's done by university students. Like it could be part of that too. So it could be a few different things. But there is oversight of that at a few levels.
Yeah, it just makes me kind of sad when I look through there and I see all these nice trees being planted, but not logically being planted. So it just kind of hurts my heart a little bit. But the other question I had was cities like Toronto, for example, they're really limited how much they can actually do as far as, you know, retaining land that's actually be. Is there any thoughts from our government or any talk about them basically sharing and in the whole aspect of, you know, a bigger area where they would have some funds that would go and they would basically be representing maybe areas like say Bancroft where there's more crown land, more land available that could be basically retained as you know future or part of your 30/30 program, right? That they would actually be able to share in the funding of having that done rather than our local pot of gold, you know, having limited quantity, where if you had bigger entities that actually could share in you know, making the whole province or all of Canada like a stronger entity.
Yeah, I could try to answer that. Through the work that we're doing on this, it's really like there's just so many layers, and each municipality is its own little, I don't want to say fiefdom, it's its own little entity, and then Crown Land is, and I feel uncomfortable using that term because it is, you know, it's questionable if it belongs to the Crown or Indigenous communities, but that is currently managed by the province, and there is not a ton of ways for conversations back and forth. And currently, the province does not seem interested in expanding protected areas, except for we have Monarch Point now, which is good. So yeah, there isn't a lot of that, and there also isn't a lot of money in this. Any money to support this work does come down through the federal government because it is a federal promise. And like I know how ENGOs access that money, but I don't know what's available for municipalities or other levels of government. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Do you have any certified any private properties? Like, say a farm was converted into a plantation. Is that has a potential for being certified is the word I'm using, but maybe is another word as a nature area?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So yeah, can private properties, it's recognized
Yeah.
towards 30 by 30? Yeah, and right now, not really. And that's kind of what I was getting at, as you know, there's pretty strict criteria to meet. So there has to be beyond, you know, the fact that you own it and you control who goes on it and you look after it. There has to be something more than that in case you decide you want to sell it, then it's not protected for the long term. So the one tool that there is conservation easements, which private landowners can enter into with a land trust.
Right.
And so that is a legal agreement that goes on the title of your property that's, and you probably know about this. It says, yeah, I agree. I'm going to manage my land this way. If I sell my land, whoever buys it has to look after it this way. And in that case, yeah, those areas might count as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, good. You're welcome.
I hope this is going to work. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So thinking about the total number of hectares and your goals, I think you said, well, you got 10,000 hectares from QC. I think one of your slides mentioned you have 29,000 and something already. I'm wondering where the other 20,000.
Millions.
Oh,
It's
okay.
millions. Yeah.
Okay. So where did they get contributed from, and how much are you looking? Is there any other active contribution happening at the time?
Okay, I see what you're asking. Of the
Mm.
ones that we've already helped make count.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely Quinte Conservation Authority, some other conservation authorities, and we have already worked with some municipalities like the city of Guelph, the city of Kitchener-Waterloo. We are a land trust. We own our own properties, so they count. And we are working with the city of Sudbury, so it's a few different municipalities. Toronto is a big one. Some of their ravines, and I think the one image was of it looked like the Don Valley in Toronto. So there's pieces in there that we went through their criteria and they count. I thought you were asking about the other millions of hectares we would need to meet 30 by 30 in Ontario, and that's some of our advocacy work for protected areas. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Within the range of municipalities that you folks are working with, because you were saying you thought that the provincial government was a little hard to work with at the moment, are any of them Eastern Ontario, like the county or anybody? Is there any sort of pulse for that kind of work in our region?
Yeah, that's a good question, Robin. And it is my colleagues leading this work. I know they've kind of done a scan. I think they're thinking about the city of Kingston. I know they've had a conversation with some people at the municipality, and it's a very nice man who I met who works for the municipality here, the county. I can't remember his name, but he's the environmental coordinator. Yeah, I know we've had conversations. Yes, thank you. Yeah, we've had conversations with him. Part of it is we kind of do a high level scan of, you know, how strong the official plan is, some of the extra things that the municipality might take on, because some municipalities really amp up their environmental ethic, and try to get like a lot of certifications, like being a bird friendly city and a bee friendly and all that. So those municipalities are the ones we targeted. It also depends on the capacity of the staff at the municipality, because although we take on a lot of like brunt work of just filling out the paperwork, they need to be able to work with us to provide all the mapping data and all the other background information. And a small municipality like the county might not have the capacity. So we have been focused in the GTA and Southwestern Ontario, but that doesn't mean there aren't municipalities in this part of the province that should participate too. Yeah, thanks.
Hello. Back in 2017, there was the international agreement, the IACHI Accord,
Yes.
where the Canadian government and most of the rest of the planet agreed to have 17% of the ground protected and 10% of the shoreline. And 7 or so years later, we're at 11%. And I think there's also targets for 2025 to have 25% and then the 30%. But maybe we need a change in our action, because I don't think very much has changed. We've added 1% in 7 years, and here we are at 24. So you'd think if there's a progression, we should have 24% protected by now, but we're still at 11. And back in 2017, I looked at the county as far as which areas were protected and what percentage of our gross area, and we were below 2%. And yet, locally, we've got fabulous habitat and a lot of vacant land, or let's say underused farms, which are not as active as they used to be, and a great variety of endangered species that are using this habitat. So I would think this is an ideal area to protect, and yet we're only at 2%. So again, we need to be more active. And how would you suggest that activity could get provoked and encouraged?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's almost, I would love to plant a question like that. That was such a good question, because you're right. There was the IHE targets. Those were the ones set in Japan to get 17% by 2020. We missed it, and now we're doing 30 by 30. And I completely agree. And my comment about the municipality was not Ontario Nature's comment. It was me as a resident living here, that the county could do so much more. Like, you guys are all part of the advocacy groups trying to push the county to do more. And that's important. And okay, this is now just personal opinion. This is not Ontario Nature opinion, but I 100% agree. We live in this beautiful area and we take for granted all the natural areas. And when I see, like, where I live, a beautiful intact woodlot that's full of all these like wood thrush and eastern wood peewee, and then someone builds a house in there, like okay, no, I'm getting worked up now. Yeah, it's a good question. You're part of the Green Party and the field naturalists, and I think just making more awareness. And that's, some of the work our group, Ontario Nature, does is advocacy and education. It's a really good question that I really should have been prepared for, because it's an important one. Like, we're missing this target. We're not going to hit the 25 by 25, obviously.
We didn't get to 17 yet.
Yeah, we're not even at 17 yet. Yeah, that is such a good question. I wish I had
Is
an
it to do
answer.
with leadership?
Pardon me?
Could it be to do with leadership?
It would be really nice to see the province make a meaningful commitment to, well, first of all, the province, neither the current government nor the previous government that was in power, make a commitment to these targets.
Also, they didn't take responsibility for failing.
Yeah, that's that's one good way to put it. Now, I think, yeah, I'm not going to say more on that. But yeah, I think we run a lot of advocacy campaigns. For those of you who are members or signed up for our newsletter action alerts, we are constantly trying to find ways to encourage the province to do more active land use planning. You know, on the map of Ontario, I said 1 million hectares is 1%. Most of Ontario is crown land. And so we can do wonderful things on private land, and we should. But to get anywhere close to 30% in Ontario, changes need to happen on crown land. Yeah. And so that is what we do. But for somewhere like the county where it's mostly private land and there's beautiful intact private land, it would be nice to see more tools being used to have a little more protection on them. And I don't follow the official planning very closely, but I know the member groups do. And I think that work's really important. And if we could eventually work, or I think having official plans with, environmentally sensitive areas that mean something. And then eventually if they could be involved in the whole 30 by 30 thing, that could help too.
Maybe there could be a consequence for not doing it,
For not meeting the global biodiversity target?
for not keeping promises. We promised all the other countries on the planet that we were going to do it by 2017, and we didn't.
Yeah.
But there was no consequence.
Well, and I don't know if any other countries met the target either.
Some have managed.
Some have. Okay, I wasn't sure.
Okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
a very awkward question.
No, it's because we are a nonpartisan organization, but we still are not happy about some of the things we're seeing happen. Yeah,
Agreed.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to answer from the Conservation Authority perspective. So I mentioned in the 1940s and 1950s, and to some degree, but it started to peter out in the 60s, our office, the conservation authorities across Ontario were subsidized to purchase burned out farms, like I mentioned. Unfortunately, the Prince Edward County Authority was late in forming. They didn't form until I think it was 1964 or 5. Don't quote me on that date. But essentially, they missed the grants from the province that went out to purchase vacant land. What they did, so the province sort of changed gears, if you will, and started providing funds to purchase recreational properties like conservation areas, and waterfront was a very particular target between the mid-60s and the mid-80s. So if you roll back history a bit, what you see in Prince Edward County are recreational properties, but not the vacant land that we would like the size and type of holding that we have in the Napanee and the wider watersheds. So I hope that helps to clarify a little anyway. Oh, sure.
Is Algonquin Park one of the areas of your conservancy? Is it part of the 30?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So for those of you who don't know, Algonquin Provincial Park has logging within it.
Mhm.
So the parts of Algonquin Provincial Park where logging does not happen do count towards 30 by 30, but where the logging happens
It doesn't.
doesn't. They are not FSC certified, and so there's no chunks within that
Mhm.
count.
Now, with the potential of forest fires in the near north, with some of these years coming, how will that affect this 30? Will it affect it at all?
Well, it shouldn't, because it's tricky with climate change and fire, because fire is a natural process in that ecosystem. And it is obviously getting, hotter fires, more frequent. But it is seen as a natural ecological process. And so the changes that would happen to the biodiversity after fire are what you expect. So those areas would still count
Okay,
as long as the management stays the
okay,
same.
thank you.
Okay. It's an interesting question.
So what I'm hearing is that we need to protect more land, but we seem to lack a political will to get the right official plans in order. in our various municipal regions to kind of push that. Is there a way as like citizens that we can amplify Ontario Nature's voice and Quinte Conservation to really push our municipalities to do more? Is, y- is that helpful?
Yeah, I think it is. And I'm just thinking of, I just saw an article in the Picton Gazette. I think it was you, Andrea, with the American eel, getting the municipality to sign on to that. And I think, and I know Quinte Conservation does things too, where you make presentations to council and encourage them. Look, this thing is important. Here's why it's important. And I think that's always valuable. And depending on the issue, sometimes, as you know, or Ontario Nature can provide support. And in terms of 30 by 30 and municipal protected areas, because now we've worked with several municipalities and have examples of what works well and things that municipalities can do. If you were interested in approaching Belleville or the county and saying, hey, like, why aren't we doing, and now I'm answering your question, Richard, that you asked before. But if they knew, oh, our citizens care, and what is this 30 by 30? And if there was interest, like, we can support that because we've been doing this work. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
So the Prince Edward County Field Naturalist did work very hard on the official plan, on the county's official plan. But it's frustrating, you know, because even then, I mean, Sheila's been giving talks on biodiversity, and a lot of we were able to get what we considered a slight win with our definition of major development in some of the protected areas and the natural core areas, but that's all based on development. So a building has to be developed. So, you know, we have a section of Greenpoint that was clear cut. You've spoken, you know, really valuable oak hickory forest, you know, that was clear cut, but there was no mechanism to protect it in our official plan. Like, we need a tree cutting bylaw or a site alteration bylaw. Those things are very difficult to get. And we even got another win we were really proud of, which was to require that there be a 50-meter setback from every kind of wetland, but still in every EIS, it's still 30 meters, even with Quinte Conservation looking at it. And this was something within the PPS at the time. I don't know whether that part's been, you know, is projected to be changed. So sometimes you get a little win municipally, but the province still, you know, overrides it. The provincial law seems to override it. So I just wanted to mention some of those frustrations working on a municipal level. I don't know if either of you have comments on that. Okay.
Well, I can speak in, and you, yeah, I was kind of watching your faces. I was talking about municipalities. It was very animated. Yeah. You know, I know, and I see the work that you do, and I'm so glad that you're at least trying. What I can tell you is, with the municipalities that we've worked with on this project, somehow something has happened where they are very proud of being part of it. So being at the council meetings in Sudbury, like, they are so excited about this project. And so sometimes I wonder if like some kind of tide needs to turn where, like, this is now something they can brag about, especially given like the context of the county and what Hastings is trying to be as these beautiful natural destinations. There might be something there. I know the province is overriding, especially Belleville, the rules, but I feel like, you know, some of the municipal leadership, some have the ability to push back, some don't, but having this thing that is celebrated, say, in the newspaper, and, you know, the federal government has given some money, I think that's what I see the power of 30 by 30 is. It just adds, it's an extra thing that kind of, it puts a spotlight on the importance of these areas. But I totally acknowledge and recognize your frustration. And so, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We're kind of skirting the questions here, and I know you guys are in a hot spot on this. But the provincial government doesn't give a damn about this. They just want development. Mr. Ford and his buddies are going to take over whatever they want in this county. I mean, they've got trees cut down already, and and politically, I think we're all of a certain age in this room, and I think we're missing the boat on the next generation. And so we need to get to them. I don't know how you do it, but talking to us is wonderful, but you need to talk to the next generation and get them fired up. And I don't know how I mean, social media maybe. I don't know if you have a plan, a communication plan on that.
Yeah, I
I
can.
mean, we need to do something.
Oh, yeah, I so hear you on that. And this is not my area in Ontario Nature. We do have,
Find an area then.
yeah, no, we do have staff who do deal with youth. Some of the slides you saw were made by our youth council. There's a certain type of youth that gets involved in this. We do have, we have a print magazine that's for people our age that like that. We do have a very active social media presence. So it's hard with different generations. And you're so right. We do what we can as our organization. And I'm sure Quinte Conservation does lots of youth things.
We do, yes, we have staff that have a communication background. But I'm not an IT guy, so I can't tell you what it is, but absolutely. And we also have staff that engage youth. As probably everyone's aware, the province and school boards don't take kids out of the classroom like they once did. That said, our staff go to the classrooms and or guide events, tours, outings on our conservation areas. And of course, we host the Frank Center Natural Resource Center for children anyway. That's actually managed in cooperation with the school board. So we're trying. That's all I can say. But it is absolutely for sure. If you don't reach kids as kids, they will not grow up, and nature things won't be a priority. I mean, that's proven.
Jerry again, mumbling through her mask. These issues are well put by Marilyn. They need to be grassroots issues, and for things to change, we need to fire up the grassroots. And that I do believe that's where the solution lies, because we have to change local political systems, provincial political systems, and federal political systems. And until that will is there at the grassroots level, I'm not terribly optimistic, sorry.
Okay, I'll go up there just so we can look at. Well, actually, I'm here from the field naturalists, on behalf of the field naturalists, to thank you both so much for a really, really valuable and thought-provoking talk dealing with these problems. We all want to protect land, and we all really appreciate what both of your organizations do, even though I was a little hard on Quinte Conservation for one moment. No. And it was really great to get the history of Quinte Conservation a bit. That was really interesting to me, Tim. I remember years ago at, I think it was one of those early meetings when we were forming the South Shore Joint Initiative. I remember you made a comment about how important, we were just talking about what the valuable things were, and you talked about how important it is for people to be able to walk through open land, like just land that has not been developed. That was really, that's always stuck with me. I remember another time talking with you when I ran after these trees had been cut in the headwaters of a creek here. And you talked about how important, how much the lands that are north that Quinte Conservation owns, how much they matter to you. So I've always have thought of that. So it's neat to hear that. And Corina, it's just really great to hear about this effort to at least try to recognize what we have that's already somewhat protected and that might fit in, because those are building blocks. And it was nice to say that it's a point of pride, like to think backwards, because I'm thinking, well, how does this lead to more protected land? But then it makes it much harder to take it away, which is just wonderful. So thank you both so much. It's been a great evening. Thanks for everyone for coming, and thanks to the Green Party for holding this. It was a terrific event. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. They were great.
We always have more questions than we have time.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
It's very